in a second. So Eva, if you could start recording. You are, great. Okay, so welcome to the first webinar of the 2019 on Think Tank School series. This is the first of many webinars. Next week we have Ruth Levine of the Hewlett Foundation, who will be talking about the relationship between funders and think tanks. So I encourage you to join that as well. Today we have our first webinar, which is going to be led by Gala Díaz. Gala is director of the Social Protection Program at CIPPEC, which is one of the leading think tanks in Latin America, certainly in Argentina. She joined CIPPEC as a research assistant in 2006 and has worked in different institutional positions before becoming program director in 2016. So we can expect Gala to talk to us from a very rich experience, but also from the perspective of someone who has been studying think tanks for a very long time. Because when Gala joined CIPPEC, I was lucky to be able to work with her in our study of think tanks and evidence-informed policy in Latin America. This webinar is going to focus on the new challenges that think tanks face, specifically around wider audiences and constituencies, and what think tanks can do about them. So I expect there will be some recommendations of action, or at least of reflection for think tanks. The way this webinar works, Gala is going to give us a brief presentation. There is a chat box that you can use. Anybody who wants to ask a question to Gala, please ask the questions via the chat box, and then at the end of Gala's presentation, I'll put the questions to her. I'll try to go through all of the questions, time permitting. Of course, if we're not able to go through all the questions, you can always follow up online with Gala and us directly. And yes, so over to you, Gala. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from these new challenges that you'll tell us about. Oh, one more thing, sorry. For those who are joining us, when you join, well, you won't know this, but please keep your microphones muted. Otherwise, we'll have to do it for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kike. Good morning to everybody, and official thanks to On Think Tanks for this space. It's a pleasure to share these reflections with you that are by no means solved. I have many more questions than answers, and I hope we will have an enriching dialogue. So many of the issues we've been discussing lately at CIPPEC arise from a diagnosis regarding the policy process. We find in Argentina, and we don't believe that it's an isolated fact of Argentina, but quite the contrary, that policy processes are getting more and more diffuse. The traditional policy process that has been set up by literature in terms of identifying a problem, assessment of different solutions, and choosing one and designing a policy, implementing it, monitoring and evaluating it, is highly contested nowadays. There are many diverse interests that are involved in the policy process that obviously they were also involved before, but since power is getting more and more diffuse, these other interests are having more and more influence in policy processes. And this growing role of diverse actors defines and redefines constantly the policy processes. So now social media is gaining more and more influence, and traditional media is declining in its influence. Corporations with innovative strategies are also having quite a lot of influence in policy processes, and even not necessarily public policy in itself, but also corporate policy has a lot of influence in what ends up happening in development overall. And also social movements, unions, and civil society are growing actors of this more disseminated and diffuse power, and how can and they can have a greater impact in the decisions and in the implementation of those decisions in different countries. We have seen that in electoral processes over the world. We have seen that in specific public policies that are being implemented. And as think tanks, we should consider this a fact in our planning and in the conduction overall of our strategies. This change has also been hand in hand with another change that has a lot of impact on what we do. That is the perception of social cohesion being on the decline. The different divides of how, for instance, nationalist, populist regimes are on the rise in different countries, and how there is a backlash to multilateralism and globalization, and the gender issues are putting more and more on the table. Those gender bias divides and social cohesion in itself, it's not being perceived as something that's growing, but quite the opposite. So there's also a socio-economic divide, and this is not only between more developed and middle or lower income countries, but also within the different countries this is being replicated. And this also goes hand in hand with a third issue that I would like to highlight as a contextual factor, that is the proliferation of information and the growing difficulty to distill that evidence and identify which information is reliable and trustworthy to use as evidence in the definition of problems and in finding solutions to those problems. There has never been a moment in history when there has been so many information available, and distinguishing what's good and bad information and all that's hard. We have been hearing about fake news and the political usage of diverse data, the concept of evidence armor. Yesterday we had a very interesting debate across the street of CIPPEC, that's the national law of financing political parties was passed. Political parties use a concept that has been forged in CIPPEC that reflects to the inclination of the football court, giving more resources to the political party that is in government. So all political parties use that term, being for or against the usage of what evidence means gets diluted as well.
Gala, sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
So many information is there. Yes.
So the connection wasn't very good. So I don't think we got that. It was breaking up for a little bit, and I don't think we got that term that you referred to in the little anecdote you told just now. If you could repeat that,
okay.
That would be great.
Yes, it's an inclination in the football court. In Spanish is cancha inclinada. That it's a metaphor, obviously, to highlight that the political party that is currently in government has more resources and more chances to win the next election due to those resources than the opposition. So they all use that same argument to go for or against the same law. So this term we've been using of evidence armor, of using the evidence as armor in political debates, washes, in some sense, cleanses the term of its meaning, because everyone uses to defend different positions. No? So I think that these three main changes that I have highlighted, is getting more diffuse, social cohesion on the decline, and evidence and information being more diffuse and less reliable, are very three issues that we should take into account as think tanks to plan and conduct our work. So regarding this first challenge, regarding the diffuse policy processes, we have been doing a great effort in trying to diagnose and acknowledge and very varied policy processes, which aren't diffuse only in the formulation, but also in the implementation and in the monitoring and the evaluation, finally, of what works and what doesn't work. And this diversity of actors isn't the same throughout the different sectors. In each sector we work on, this diversity takes a different form. And being able to diagnose it very precisely is an opportunity for think tanks, because it enables to have more entry points to our discussions. If, for instance, social movements are a relevant actor in the definition of the strategy to reduce poverty in a specific country, then it provides an extra entry point, being able to conduct dialogues with social movements to inform those discussions with evidence produced by the think tank. It is an opportunity to have a greater impact. But enabled to be an opportunity and not a challenge, we should have this very profound diagnosis of who is interacting with who and how are they interacting, to increase the chances of seizing effectively this potential. This means to engage with wider audiences, and with audiences that think tanks aren't usually accustomed to engage with. So I wanted to share very briefly an experience we have been conducting at CIPPEC. This year in Argentina, we have presidential elections. And every year that there are presidential elections, we try to highlight specific issues that we think are strategic for the next administration to take on, that would help transform and develop Argentina and increase the quality of living of everyone who lives in our country. So in the past, we had highlighted issues by highlighting the evidence that back them. So we would say, for instance, well, early childhood is important because evidence suggests that investing in early childhood brings more returns. And in Argentina, the diagnosis is that we don't invest much in early childhood, so we should. That proved to be effective in terms of highlighting discursively certain issues. But then when it came to the implementation, these more diffuse processes weren't enabling concrete implementation of those priorities that were highlighted in the discourse. So this year we have designed an alternative process that it's being quite interesting. We are ongoing in its implementation. So we did choose 10 issues that we think are strategic for the next administration, but we discuss them with different actors. So, for instance, one of those issues is poverty, poverty in its whole, but focusing on chronic poverty, those families who are less likely to get out of poverty in a certain time. So we did the research, we did the diagnosis of Argentina, we did the diagnosis of the public policies that are being put in place to address those issues. And when we had this contrast and some recommendations started to arise, we started conducting different meetings with different stakeholders. So we conducted meetings with social movements. In Argentina, there is a very strong tradition of social movements that represent informal workers that have been very present in the public debate since the 2001 crisis. And specifically in productive strategies or in social strategies, they do have a big say, and they are very relevant actors in the Congress and with the executive as well. So we did conduct a first meeting with them to implications that arose from our research. And we had a very rich debate with the technical reference of the different social movements that are present in Argentina, from the rural sector, from urban sectors, the more far to the left, the more far to the center. And we gather them all here, actually in this same room. And it was a very enriching discussion where they put in the recommendations what would be most important for informal sector workers to increase the possibilities to get out of poverty. This same type of dialogues we are conducting with the corporations, with the private sector, with the unions, with the trade unions that represent formal sector workers, with religious groups that do have a big say in overall poverty strategies in Argentina, despite it being we're still Latin America after all, and also with the media and with civil society, of course. So these different dialogues will have proven to be very useful, not only in identifying basic consensus. For instance, we should create employment and grow economically to reduce poverty, which everyone will be in agreement, but how to do that? Who should do that, in which territories, which industries should be involved, how can we increase the chances for less qualified workers to get into those productive processes. And there is not much consensus. And we are not striving to find consensus, but we are striving at least to identify dissensus and have very clear which are the different strategies that the different sectors are putting on the table to face those same problems. We believe that by systematizing those debates, it's already a step forward in the public debate, because there is no real discussion of the strategies. In Argentina, the discussion of poverty in the public debate is, well, it went up 2 points, it went down, and there is no serious discussion of how can we change that. So we are systematizing those debates and we're putting them in a very short document that we will share with the presidential candidates next month. And their teams, we have actually a couple of hours been confirmed that one of the main candidates will receive us in 1 month to discuss this very specific issue. And be able to also present him with the different alternatives that arise from the different sectors, and saying, well, this is backed by evidence, this not so much, but you have a very big, for instance, corporate interest in doing this, so and so. And this also put in dialogue with the diagnosis we did of the public policies. How should the executive change or create new initiatives that would help in facing this problem? But this also acknowledges that it's not solely the responsibility of the state, which of course should have a role in leading and guaranteeing that these policies are being implemented, but if doing so in cooperation with these different actors, or at least in articulation and knowing what the others are doing and what the others think they should do, it's a huge step forward in aligning the different actions that are being put in place concretely in the terrain. This obviously varies also from sector to sector. The example I've shared with you regarding poverty is probably one of the less, the one that has more consensus of the relevance of the issue and of the need to do something about it, but the less consensus in how to do it or what to do. This is not the same, for instance, in gender, where there is much more consensus on what to do, and there is a lack of political will or hierarchization in the concrete assignation of resources of what to do. We are doing this in 10 different issues. Many of those issues are transversal within different programs at CIPPEC. For instance, in poverty, it's being led by social protection, that it's a program I direct, but it's also obviously in articulation with education program, with the urban cities, urban development program, and the economic development program, obviously. And we have many other initiatives that are also joint between different programs, and some are merely sectorial, for instance, transform secondary education. I would like to maybe tell you a bit how, and I think we do have time, how this initiative was managed and is currently being managed within CIPPEC, not with the different actors, because it was a long design process, and now it's being shifted as we move forward. So as I told you at the beginning, last year we tried to do this diagnosis of each one of these 10 issues, of which are the actors and how should we do it. And we did that through different lenses. We at CIPPEC, we have a divide between the programmatic areas that study and research specific topics, and the institutional areas that are communications, institutional development, administration, and the executive direction. So what we did was to sit each referent from each specific sector with each of the directors of the institutional areas. So we said, well, communication, how is this issue being dealt with in the public debate? Which are the actors that are being involved in the media, and how are these positions articulated in the media debate around poverty, for instance. Then we sat with the person responsible of public affairs. So he shared with us how this issue was being debated more politically in Congress, which were the actors that were actively lobbying Congress on these specific issues, and which were the main legislators involved, and which interests did they represent. How was this being managed politically from the executive? Who led this? What does that mean? Is the executive, is the social development minister, or is the chief of cabinet also involved in this? That meant that it had a higher hierarchy within the government's agenda. How many resources are being assigned to the policies that should this? How did that evolve from the last administration to the current administration? We also sat with the person involved in institutional development, that is the area responsible for fundraising. And we did a mapping of which were the main partners that we would like to have on board for this project, and what would that mean in terms of ensuring that the project had the resources available to be developed. So after a very obvious and first assessment, we said, well, we would like to have the UN sitting with us at this. So we went to the UNDP, and luckily, we were very lucky, they said yes from the very first moment, and now it's a joint project between the UN and CIPPEC, and also a third partner, because we did an assessment of what did we have as resources within CIPPEC and what did we lack. And one of the main things we lacked was a very strong econometric view of the simulations that we could do in terms of identifying these households that had less chances of getting out of poverty. So we partner with an institute that is very renowned in doing these types of studies from a national university. And now it's a joint project between the STEDLAS, that it's a center of studies of, it's a center for development, labor, social studies from the La Plata University, the UNDP, and CIPPEC. And this obviously was done at the beginning, but it's not written in stone. Every 2 weeks, we have an internal meeting with these actors I met to review the strategy and to say what did we do in the past 2 weeks and what in the next 2 weeks, and what do we need from the institution, from CIPPEC, to be able to do those things. So these meetings are very useful. For instance, well, we would need the UNDP to call the ILO for them to facilitate this meeting with the trade unions we would like to do. So then the institution will start to articulate to make that happen. So those meetings of strategic follow-up, we call it, are very, very useful to maybe correct on the margin, the decision that we had made from the beginning, and analyze if the current context means we should change anything. So regarding the second issue, the social cohesion and the perception of less cohesive societies overall, I would like to focus on one very specific issue, which is gender. And we have been working on gender for the past 9 years, maybe now. And we obviously, as a think tank, we try to promote public policies being implemented on this specific issue. But we came to the conclusion a couple of years ago, after having a couple of years of experience working on that issue, that we should not try to impose to the government or influence the government to do something that we weren't doing within the institution. So we started working on a strong gender policy within CIPPEC that meant to change not only how we advocated for gender equity in the public policies in Argentina, but also how did we mainstream gender within our programmatic areas and within the institutional human resources design of CIPPEC. So this was a very strong discussion we had throughout last year and 2017 within the CIPPEC's executive committee. And at CIPPEC, we have a problem, which might be a good problem. We have an excess of women. We have a highly feminized staff. And we have parity at director level. But our board didn't have that gender balance. Our board is still mainly male dominated. But we started to work on getting a quota in the persons that were being included in our board, and also in establishing different mechanisms throughout the human resources processes that would enable higher balance in all the positions, so throughout the pyramid of hierarchy. This also meant that we had to introduce some changes. We did have very strong policies to conciliate work and family at CIPPEC, but some of them were only available for women. So CIPPEC conducted a very active shift in those policies to get workers at CIPPEC that were fathers to get more involved in the raising of their children. So flexible time and paternal leave are quite extensive in CIPPEC. And also CIPPEC pays for the care centers of the children of the people who work at CIPPEC. Finally, this also impacted in our annual dinner. CIPPEC conducts every year a fundraising event. Is where around between 25 and 30% of our budget is raised. And it's the most visible political event in Argentina, where all political forces come together, and the president often comes and addresses the guests. And in the past, actually, when Julia Pomares, the current executive director, took office in 2016, that first dinner that she conducted, only 12% of the guests were women. This obviously reflects a huge imbalance that there is in the political sphere in Argentina, and in the media and in the corporate sector, etc., because all of those actors are being represented there. But we did engage and made strong efforts to gain more gender balance in the last 3 annual dinners, not only to enable networking opportunities for women who joined us at that event, which is quite relevant because there's a lot of relevant stakeholders there, but also to enable more of this role model effect outside of the dinner. This event is highly publicized in the media, and there are pictures like the red carpet and stuff like that. And being able to showcase that there are women in all the relevant sectors, in corporations, in the media, in the political realm, etc., also enables young girls to identify with the possibility of being a CEO or being a member of parliament. So we asked actively corporations that bought tables for this event to have at least one, but we suggested half and half gender balance, at least one woman. And it's worked partially. This year we had 30% of women, which meant that there were around 500 women in this event. We did a photo of all of them that was huge, as you can imagine, and that triggered a lot of discussions. I have some reflection on evidence, but I think I would prefer to go. Maybe we can address some of those.
Thank you, Gala. Yes, I think, I mean, those are two very, very big and important issues, clearly linked. I take from this that to be able to engage with a wider audience, a more diverse audience, because they are playing important roles in policy making, a think tank like CIPPEC has to do things differently. So it has to work differently within its teams and across teams. It has to think about challenges in a completely different way, and it might require different skills and competencies, both institutional and personal. But the second point you made was also very important, because it means that you have to adopt certain principles as well, that will make you, could turn you into a different kind of organization. That not only makes recommendations about gender balance in public life, but acts on those recommendations itself. And I guess that would be also relevant for organizations advocating for greater transparency in public finances, for example. More evidence-based policies. Again, how does that reflect in the way that or the think tanks themselves behave? So let me go straight. I have a couple of questions, but I'll leave them for a bit later. I'll go straight to questions asked by participants. Ulrich is asking, he has 3 questions. First, I would like to find out if your institution is a free market think tank. It's about transparency, I guess. Second, can we find the results of your studies on chronic poverty in Argentina? I guess the answer is everything CIPPEC is published on your website. Third, are there any recommendations that could inspire developing countries in Africa? From your own experience and your own interaction with think tanks around the world, maybe in your participation in the T20, what do you think might be lessons of the CIPPEC experience that could be taken up by think tanks in other regions?
Sorry. Well, 3 very interesting questions, especially 1 and 3. I'm not sure to be understanding correctly the concept of a free market think tank. We do work on economic development. We understand that the intervention of the state is needed to create greater justice, but I don't think that's what the question is targeted at. If it's more of a publicizing of how we're being funded and transparency, we are. We do have an integrity and policy at CIPPEC, where it's actually the UN guidelines that we implement, and we can share those with you if you're interested, where we go through all of the possible donors that are identified, and we go through a series of analysis to see whether they would be able to be donors of CIPPEC. This is in all the realms, whether they're supporting a specific project or whether they are willing to make a donation, or they are trying to participate from this annual dinner, the main fundraising events, etc. And we are also in a process of actually right now to become a member of Transparify, which is an organization that fosters transparency within think tanks. So we are actually now organizing the website to be able to identify each donor to a project and to the amount that was donated. There's obviously a threshold of, I think it's something around $5,000 or so. So below that, you just have to, there is anonymity, and then above that, you'll have to specify the amount and the specific purpose of each donation, which has been quite an interesting process. We do also do an accountability action by the end of each year, where we specify where we work, how we work, where did we get the funding to work there. We have very strict rules regarding the funding that comes from governments. Only less than 30% of our budget can come from governmental sources. Now it's less than 10%, I think. And within that amount, there are very strict rules of how should we ensure a diverse political participation, so ensuring that the same political party shouldn't have more than a certain amount of that overall governmental funding. Regarding the second question, and please, Ulrich, let me know whether that answered your question. Regarding the second question, actually the issues of this initiative of engaging with the next administration, it's called META, that would translate into strategic goals transforming Argentina. And as we are trying to engage actively with the political actors right now, we will be publishing all these diagnoses that we have been working on for the past year and a half online by the beginning of June. So you will find something, but you will not find a lot. You will find something more a month or so, where this short memo will the documents that those recommendations are online. By looking towards the next administration, by
Gala, I think we're having trouble with your connection now.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did you hear?
I think I'll give your internet connection time to catch up. But I think what you were saying is that I've just shared the link to the Meta project on the chat. It's cippec.org/meta, META, and you were saying that there isn't much there yet, but there will be a lot more in a month or so when you've had a chance to share the reports with the different stakeholders. And these are short memos.
There one short memo for each of the priorities, and then there's a lot more of research that will be online also in a couple of weeks that is used to back the recommendations that are included in those memos. And I was also saying that by the end of this year, by November, we'll have a lot more information in that website, because there's a twist in this project that right now we're focusing on what would help to raise the hierarchy of the different issues in the political debate, in the presidential debates, and with the different candidates. And we are planning on putting much more instrumental information for the next administration by the end of this year online. So we'll have, for instance, a geo-referentiation of the different policies, how they are being implemented in the provinces, what should be the focus of the different corporations, etc. So regarding the third question that Ulrich posed, well, I'm no expert on Africa, but I think we might be sharing some of these challenges we face in Argentina. Surely the CIPPEC's participation in the T20, which we led last year, was a huge leap forward in how we discuss and how we think of certain issues. Being able to interact with this wider international network and with the most relevant think tanks of Europe, of the US, and also from Asia, from Africa, and from other Latin American countries, has proven to be very enriching in identifying the dilemmas that are arising and will be much more relevant in the future, but also in how to do that. So we learned a lot by working hand in hand, for instance, with Chatham House or with the Kiel Institute, but also with Fundación Getulio Vargas or with JICA from Japan. That's certainly a lesson learned. Another lesson that we learned throughout the last couple of years is the relevance to have the strategic perspective of what we want to do and which policies we'd like to influence throughout the whole process of the institution. So when we do the fundraising, we should already be thinking of how those actors that are being able maybe to fund some specific research, how are they influencing, or how their being there affects the possibility of that policy being influenced, or how should we think the communication from the very beginning of the process to increase those issues. And that forcibly means to focus on very few issues. We cannot do this for a very wide agenda. We need to pinpoint like very specific issues and focus on them to do this work with quality and being effective in the long run.
Gala, I am going to ask you a question from Scarlett, and we're kind of running out of time. So Scarlett, I will follow up with Gala and CIPPEC because I've been meaning to write up an article or a how-to or something on CIPPEC's annual Gala, because it's a story worth sharing. But if you could, try to quickly paint a picture of what the Gala is about. Some of the questions she's asking are who is the audience, what's the guest list, how do you make sure that these donations, these sort of sponsoring of tables does not compromise CIPPEC's independence? Briefly.
Yeah, so we have been doing this gala for 13 years. At the beginning, it was a fundraising event, so everyone who was willing to put some money in CIPPEC would be able to come, and it was a very small meeting when it started. Around 400 people gathered, and now we have over 1,500 people, very high-level people. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the main political event in the year of Argentina. So this means it changes, it focus shifted from being a purely fundraising event to a more political and strategic event for the institution. It is obviously an event that positions CIPPEC in a specific way in the political arena, and we need to be very careful in how it positions the institution. So there are three main areas that lead the organization of this annual dinner. Well, obviously under the executive direction, but the institutional development, which is a fundraising part that does engagement with the corporations and with the individual donors, etc. Communications, who do we want sitting there from the journalists? How do we want this dinner to be communicated? And we, a couple of years ago, we started doing sorts of living rooms within the cocktail area, where the main media news flash from the event next province, and they would interview them in live from the dinner. That proved to be very useful. And thirdly, the third area involved is the public affairs area, where we do the political balance to ensure that we have a very diverse representation, so we don't get co-opted from a specific political party. Every time the president comes is a challenge, because obviously there is this bias towards the officialism, and being able to show diversity aside from the relevance of the president itself, it's very challenging. We did put a strong focus on that this year, and we had two of the main presidential candidates sitting there when the president was speaking from the opposition, and we had like 35% of the main leaders of the opposition also sitting there. So what we did was we asked the director of the filming of the dinner that showed everything on the screens to focus on those people there, so we could identify and showcase that they were sitting there when the president was speaking. It was an effort. I don't think it was enough. We still need to do a bit more to ensure that the independence we have in the terms of the diversity of our funding and in terms of the diversity of our political engagement is more truthfully reflected in the event. Probably next year after the elections, this will change. This was a year of presidential elections, so everything gets that flavor, and it's even more difficult to get this independence during these kinds of years. But there are many efforts, and I would suggest Kike to speak with these three persons that are leading this organization for when you want to write this article, because I think there is a lot to be learned there that I myself am not very familiar with, because thankfully I'm not very involved in that.
Great. Thank you, Gala. We'll follow up on that. Maybe we could do a webinar on the annual dinner. I do remember when it was beginning, and it was certainly not the political event that it's turned out to be. I've shared the link to the microsite on CIPPEC's website to the annual dinner. There's some videos and excellent, lots of information about it. Anyway. Thank you very much, Gala. We've run out of time. We meant these webinars to be short, but also to leave us wanting a bit more. So if anybody would like to follow up and get in touch with Gala, ask some questions, just send us an email. You know how to find us on Think Tanks, and we will put you in touch with Gala if that's okay with her. Also, this video has been recorded, and we'll be sharing it with those who've joined us at the webinar, but also anybody who hasn't had a chance to join. It will be on our YouTube channel that I invite you to subscribe to, because this year we're going to have a lot of content being published in video form, including an excellent video on what is a think tank that is coming up soon. Let's see if we can try to define it. So again, thank you, Gala. Thank you, CIPPEC, for sharing your experience. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye.